Welcome, everyone, all of our YouTube audience today to hear our dialogue on barriers for breakfast, where we kind of talk with innovators across the space, colleagues, good friends on what's happening now and where the future of learning and work is headed. And today's special guest is also a special friend. We've known each other for almost a decade now, and welcoming Rose Colby to the program. The list is very long with Rose in terms of leading this great work of competency-based learning in New Hampshire, leading it nationally with organizations like Two Revolutions and Aurora Institute and Competency Work, and really understanding the space from both K-12 and higher ed as she's worked with universities such as Southern New Hampshire. She's been involved in the PACE work in New Hampshire and taking the state into competency-based education, and just thrilled to have her on the program today. And Rose, we're going to kick this off with kind of, why are you in this work? There's a lot of other things you could be doing, and there's things that you've led throughout your career, but you always strike me as still really passionate about competency-based learning. And we're going to get into where the state of it is today and also where it's headed. But tell our listeners a little bit about why it matters to you.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's the passion. I love teaching. I still teach. I consider myself a teacher first. Probably when I was a high school teacher, biology and chemistry teacher, and I kind of got into teaching through a back door. I was working in microbiology and a quality control capacity for a private company, and I didn't really think about teaching, and things just kind of, I don't know why it worked that way, but I thought teaching might be something I'd like to do. I wasn't getting really the sense of self-worth in the job that I was doing. Not that I was really unhappy with it. It just didn't hit the mark for me, I guess. And at the time, New Hampshire needed, or I was in Goffstown at the time, they needed science teachers. So I took a bank of courses in the summer at St. Anselm's College in Manchester, and did my student teaching while I was doing the courses in independent work. That's how I got in the classroom. And so I never was a conventional teacher because I never got the background to do it. I just followed my instincts, right? And really evolved over time. I loved my teaching. But I did kind of have like people knock on the door saying, how are you doing this? Why do you do it this way? And got a little bit of attention for that as a teacher. And then went into, I actually had a mentor at the time who encouraged me to kind of shake it up in the world of education and become an administrator. And to this day, he's still my mentor, and I've learned a lot under his tutelage and with his inspiration. But the passion has just been there for me. And when we were really doing kind of the breakthrough work, probably around 2007, 2008 in New Hampshire, it really forced me to speak to that passion, not passion, but what needed to change in education, how the classroom needs to change for kids. And it was really at that level. I love working with teachers. And that's where my conversations always are, is speaking to, what's going on? How are you designing learning? How do you open up to inquiry? And what pathways, what are the ways that you can support kids, doing different things in different ways and validating their learning in a very authentic way. And I think being involved in school administration, I was a principal of a large middle school of 1,300 kids. And we really were at the high end of, the turning point middle school model, the powerful student teams. Our school was that. And I just was like, why shouldn't high schools be that way? Why can't elementary is closer to it? But I started really thinking of the systemic needs for change, to really support our teachers in the classrooms to do good work. Then our systems have to support it. And we can't get them all fired up to, oh, this is great. Why don't we do this? And then have all the barriers float up that are hardwired into the DNA code of the system that they're in. And so I've just been plugging along, I think if I look at kind of the tenets and the beliefs of CBE today, they're the same as they were back in 2007, 2008. I think we're at a point in time, especially post-pandemic, that a lot of schools have realized that traditional model of curriculum instruction and assessment doesn't really fit what our kids need for their futures. And I think there's there's a lot of folks doing this work now, which is really exciting. I think we have to be careful that we are sure that this work is of high quality, and it just isn't the same old thing with a different name.
Yeah. Great context. We're here today with Rose Colby talking about, the state of competency-based ed, where it's been, where we've had some key learnings in the pandemic, and also where we think it's headed. Rose, when I met you in 2011, we both were at Two Revolutions, and I was armed with knowledge of a no-zero policy with Doug Reeves. My wife, who had taken me through Dylan Williams' work, John Hattie's work, sort of thinking about assessment of and assessment for learning in different ways. But it was really when we came together to work on the New Hampshire work and also school-based side work, where I started to see the conditions that needed to be in place and the learning journey that needed to happen. So I'd love for you to characterize, say, from 2011 right up to the pandemic, what are some of the secret recipes? What are the things you write about in terms of conditions that leaders need to understand, learning agendas they need to go on, how they need to get into this space of CBE? Just give us that perspective of the state of CBE before COVID. And then we're going to talk a lot about what happened during COVID and where we're headed.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think if and kind of give, be sure I'm aiming and getting at really the heart of this in my answer, and push and probe me like you usually do if I don't. I really think the leadership, the call for leadership in schools today is one that you really have to be self-reflective about your own leadership style, where it comes from, and who you are. Okay, as an individual, your own belief systems, which I think are very important, that drive you to do good work every day. But there's two sides to, and I'm just going to speak to the principal position. I'll talk about superintendents in a minute, but from a principal point of view, you walk into your building every day, and there's a management side to the job. Okay, and then there's the work of teaching and learning going on in your school. Some folks, and observation, and I've been in, like you, in hundreds of buildings, and you can really tell what kind of leader is in that building. You can tell that some schools are led by managers, and you have some schools who are led by the instructional leader. Okay, but I find that what principals, school leaders, and I'm going to also now broaden that out to say teacher leaders, because one thing we learn in doing this work, in changing the old guard system, is that it takes more than one person in a building. It takes a team of leaders. It's cultural change that takes place in our schools. The culture around both teaching and learning. Principals, some of the best principals I know, in having conversations with them, they really say, I want to leave the teaching to our teachers. They're our experts. We need to draw on their expertise and culture that expertise. Right. So my role as a leader now becomes not just being sure that the bells go off on time, and all those things are important. I'm not saying they aren't, okay, but my role as a leader then is to really provide the professional learning time within the context of the day, so that we're not sending teachers for training, okay, to come back and do it. That doesn't work. But to recognize the inherent expertise and the love of their craft and their science, really, to move forward, okay, to better meet the needs of each child. And at the same time, having the ability and the power for teachers to question the status quo. Okay. I've gone into some schools where, you know, we're really wanting to move forward in CBE, and having conversations with teachers. They'll say, we're so bogged down with required assessments that we have to do. We don't have the time to teach the paced curriculum, one size fits all paced curriculum that these district and state tests demand that we follow. We don't have the time to teach it, and now our kids have to take it on a prescribed day, and they're not ready for it. So, you know, on the other side of it, when you examine the data, you automatically think, uh-oh, something's wrong here. The kids are, you know, performing poorly, or, you know, below grade level, but they're not really, they're almost blaming the kids for why they're not performing, or blaming the teacher. That's always a good scapegoat. And they're not looking to the conditions, you know, the conditions that that allow teachers to make the best decisions for kids. That, as I have always used, our 4 pillars, Brian: time, technology, resources, you know, the talent, you know, and oftentimes going in to talk with teachers, I'll say, well, you can't work a different model for teaching and learning in your classroom unless you have the supports for time and talent. Look at your grade level teachers. How can you use this talent differently? Okay. And what kind of time would you like to see? All right. And they say, oh, well, we have a schedule. And I go back to the leader and say, listen, your teachers are saying you're inflexible about how time is used. And if you're going to be inflexible about time, then you can't expect them to create a different model with different outcomes for kids, even if your hope is that they're going to test better. That's a low bar for me. So back to the leadership piece, how do you empower teachers to have control over how they use their professional talent? Okay, either within a team at middle school level, within a PLC, however, okay, but how can you best use, okay, those very important pieces that are the real levers for systemic change? And allow, you know, really encourage leaders to say, just try it. You know, you don't have to make a schedule that's going to last a year. Make a schedule that will do this. Ask the teachers to make the schedule and try it for 3 weeks.
Right.
You don't want to try it for a year if it's not going to work.
That's right.
Okay. So that continual iteration piece, you know, just try it, work it, change it, throw it away and say, that's not going to work for us.
Right.
But I still believe that the act of teaching and learning, even through that kind of change, is better than and will serve more kids than the traditional model of the one size fits all.
One of the things you shared there, and certainly that I learned from you, is people often see competency-based education in a way that, you know, it requires a lot of understanding or professional learning or calibration to the current grading system, or, you know, to replace it. It requires a lot of courageous kind of conversations around that. And so, you know, one of the places I often think about that we know together is Sanborn, where they you know, took that issue head on and said, hey, here's the report card that'll work for whatever percentages of colleges and merit scholarships need to have happen. And then here's the assessment of children that really shows you where they are and what they can do and what they've mastered. And so, you know, in situations we've worked together, the sense I always got was people needed to really understand CBE. They needed to pick up your books. They needed to have some time in powerful teams or PLCs to really understand. Then once they did, prototype it, right? Say with this grade level or with this 3-teacher team, we're going to look at assessment differently. And we're going to give you some data back on what our kids are learning and how they're demonstrating that learning. But, you know, we all went to school, and parents have a funny way of worrying about points and worrying about, you know, the outcome of the learning visibly into a grade or a numeric. And what we're seeing, and I shared this on a vidcast recently, what we're seeing is you do all of that point mongering, and then kids get out into the world and they can't actually demonstrate what the points said they could demonstrate. You know, that's our great challenge as leaders. One of these days we're just going to call it learning, and the better way to learn is based in competencies that you can demonstrate. So you know, that's been powerful over the years. You were kind enough to let us contribute an article or a chapter in one of your books around, you know, how professional learning needs to also be in the competency-based methodology, that what teachers know and are able to do and what they can demonstrate needs to be on the job and showing evidence of that work, talking about student work. So you mentioned superintendents. I wanted to follow on with that. National tenure says they average 3 or 4 years, and you know my take on it. If that's going to be your average, then do something big. Why are you doing something status quo? So when you work with the good ones, what's some of the things you observe? You mentioned great principles. What's happening with these leaders who really get competency?
Yeah, I think it's the politics, you know, it's how that superintendent handles the politics is the key to their success within a district, really. And yes, they need to be the visionary that says, this is where we're going, but really needs to get the toxic practices out, especially if you're new coming in, you know. Start asking the why question. Why are you doing that? And, you know, where's the evidence that says that that's something that we should be doing? Right. I mean, the first thing you do is say, there isn't anything out there from anyone who's published, and I'm pretty on top of the grading issue, that is going to say a 0 to 100 grade scale is fair. Why are you're coming on and you are now ascribing to that. Right. And so how can you not look at what's there to say, first, we have to look at what's equitable for kids. Okay. Do they all have equal access to a quality education? Do they have the opportunities to learn in different ways, in different places? And does each child have a pathway for success? So what are the systemic changes? Now, these pathways can kind of cluster together. Okay, I'll give you an example. In an urban setting, you may have poverty as an issue. You may have in any schools, high schools, for example, you may have kids who are no longer living with their parents. They're couch surfing. You may have young moms. Okay, and we just can't say, here's school, here it is, the way we do it. And you have to fit it. You really do have to have that strong belief that says, how can we make systemic changes in how we do what we do so that we can meet different needs, because the needs are out there. And based on your local, who you are as a school, the community that you're in, you can pretty much figure out what those different needs are. So design to that. Right. So a young mom has childcare issues. What are the community resources that now school's taking on a different role, right? Now you're drawing on the community to support your kids within school. Okay. And I think our communities are ready for that outreach by schools, and we don't do enough of that. We have a lot of help out there. And, you know, how can we arrange a schedule for a young mom where they can come into school later in the day? that social services can access, access them to help them with better being able to continue with an education? How can we give them online support if they're taking online courses? How can they have, do they have a drop-in center with access to teachers during the day on their schedules to get support to be successful with online learning? Not all kids are.
Right.
And is there, evening programs that are available that the school can provide either in their community or a neighboring community to get that student to graduation? So it's that think differently piece that a leader, a superintendent, has to have that kind of clarity of vision, okay, around the outcomes for their students and the success of their student. I think, and I think our last 2 years has accelerated this, I don't think we measure the success of our schools just in terms of the number of kids that get accepted to good colleges.
Yeah, it's great. And I so appreciate the instincts around this tension of superintendents both setting a vision and also inspecting it, managing the messaging and the politics around it. So key to when you recognize a great one or one that understands that and how they do it. I want to pose this list as a question. I want to talk to you about Bryan Setser's assessment of COVID and competency, and then I want you to push and probe and kind of, pull me in directions that are based on your insights and what you saw. So less of a question. I'm just going to give you my assessment of what I observed during COVID. I've often called it the great exposure, that once things were put online, I want to totally honor that teachers were working in unprecedented times, that they were asked to pivot and do things that were not in any way fair or just. But a lot of what they were being asked to do, including my daughter, was propping up an already poor system of teaching and learning. So what you saw was digital syllabus making their way online with lack of supports, this expectation that they concurrently teach and both teach virtually and in the face-to-face. And no matter who I asked at the central office level, whether it was, a client or somebody in the industry, there was a real sort of pass the buck around, well, who dictated to you that all kids needed to learn in the same way online in the same blocks throughout the day? And you wouldn't hear a lot of, well, the state said so, or the superintendent said so. You would often hear at the very local level, the CAO wanted this for proof, or they wanted this for accountability that people were logging on.
Absolutely.
So the virtual guy in me that I've been for a lot of my career was like, you do understand that the 4 pillars, time and technology, allow you to not sit people on a Zoom for 5 hours. Like like full stop. You have the capabilities to change that dynamic. And if you do, you now don't have to worry as much about learning loss. In a competency environment, they can demonstrate where they are in multiple periods of time through multiple talent supports and through different technologies. So I actually saw a boon for competency-based education who had been working this way for some time and said, look, we have different ways and different assessment techniques that kids can demonstrate, whether they're online, offline. Our challenge is, how do we adjust to those new environments, but make it about something we do together? So I looked at it as a time period of like a resurgence of CBE, because people, I think, saw the great exposure. You had more people flocking to other models, alternative models, where they could learn in a way that was not test bound, that was not specific to didactic linear learning. And so I also don't want it to be a great crisis that we waste, but I wanted to share my assessment of that time period and see what you were also seeing from a CBE lens.
Yeah, I think well, first off, on the national level, we've been trying to keep a real eye on it. I'm going to say that the 18 months. I'm going to actually say 2 school years, because 2 school years were impacted, and the general tapping into, our schools that have been doing this for 15 and 20 years, and that have really, grown out of that old traditional model. Doesn't, I'm thinking of the Kettle Moraines and the Sanborns to a certain extent, but Lindsay Unified, a lot of these places have been doing this for so long. They moved into the online learning, bringing that structure, okay, of personalized learning, of having kids demonstrating their learning in different ways as the natural part of who the teachers were in designing learning for kids. And they use technology to facilitate that. Okay. The situations, and I have to say, those of us doing this work have gotten a lot of phone calls this year. I've heard a lot of tears from teachers who said, I have to be online at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
And I have to keep my computer on until 3. And my kids are expected to sit there and do this. And what leaders aren't really focusing on is they're saying, 30% is about the number that's propping up a lot of different places of the kids that tuned out of learning over a 2-year period of time.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so you say, why? What did they do? Would you sit in front of a computer? I mean, we do a lot of computer work, but I don't know about you. I'm not, I do work all day, but you can't do that. And so the kids very simply turn their screens off. Okay. And they're blaming the kids. They're saying, oh, parents aren't supervising their kids. The kids don't complete the work, so they don't turn the computer on. They don't log into class because they haven't done their work. I'm like, wait a minute. Oh, this is the wrong interpretation of what's happening. All right. If I walk through a traditional high school, and I know you've done the same, and I walk by classrooms, I can guarantee you, I can pick out about 30% of every classroom of kids who've tuned out the face-to-face instruction because it's one size fits all.
Yep.
So they're saying, oh, we have to have face-to-face because that's the only way, that's the only thing that can be successful for our kids. I'm saying, be careful.
Yes.
Prove that to me. All right. Prove that to me, because I'm not so sure.
Sorry to interrupt. It's such a huge point. It's the famous Marzano study of, he goes into 1,500 classrooms across the US at different times a day, and it's 88% lecture, So all of this love affair with it'll be better in face-to-face, such a huge point.
Right. Exactly. So we do know that schools who are on the journey towards CBE and this multi-year journey, wherever they're at in that evolution, they moved into this better. I would probably have to really hone in on one model that I think is probably one of the reasons why teachers are leaving the classroom, is the expectation that half of your kids are at home looking in on a classroom, the other half of the kids sitting in the classroom with the teacher, and the teacher is expected to moderate the learning. I can't even say teach, to moderate the learning with kids in front of him or her and monitoring what's going online. How anyone could ask teachers to teach and be successful and to meet the teacher's needs. I mean, this is the time that we really had to circle around our professionals and support them in the best way possible. And that's not a good way to do it.
No.
Parents didn't like it. Kids didn't like it. A lot of the kids took that, I'm going to take the day off on those hybrid days,
Sure.
We were doing this for 2 years, Brian. Why didn't they change? Why didn't someone say, this doesn't work?
That's right.
Let's, figure this out, but let's talk to our parents. Literally not in a school board meeting where they're in complaining and screaming and yelling, probably rightfully so, but let's engage them and talk to them. What's going to work best for us to teach your kids while you're working at home and you have kids of 3 different levels, elementary, middle, and high school, and you're trying to also work. How can we make this work? You know, and I think we would have had far better and a greater variety of instructional models out there if we just worked with it. But it just seemed like we're doing this, and that's what they did for 2 school years.
Yeah, totally get it. I am here today on our Barriers for Breakfast livecast with Rose Colby, talking a lot about competency-based education, why we both got in that work, what it's looked like across the country pre-COVID and during COVID. I want to take us on those 4 pillars to the future. And I, again, want to characterize this as an assessment of what I think is happening and where I think it could go, and then kind of what you're seeing in the same vein, because you also flex among K-12 and higher ed and kind of have some understanding about the journey in both spaces. You know, a few years back, I read Chris Deede's work at Harvard about the 60-year curriculum. I was very interested in DeMillo's work at Georgia Tech about a lifetime portfolio and kids learning and being able to, you know, sign on for a university, but drop in and drop out, stop in and stop out, and kind of assemble their life portfolio. And then one of the things that I absolutely reject that I often hear is, well, badges are trendy, or credentials are trendy. And I'm like, actually, that's not the conversation. The conversation is, how are we going to assure stackable skills that are also supported by coherent, you know, mindsets, knowledge sets, you know, humanities-based thinking, ethics. Our great challenge is not becoming over skills based, but at the same time, honoring upskilling to get more people into the workforce and to create greater equity, and ensuring that they can think with a civics mindset and can detect lies and get through misinformation. So where I see CB headed is really CBE for all. It's like, I can imagine a future for my younger boys where they are assembling their education. It may take place somewhat at a schoolhouse, it may take place somewhat online, and it may take place in the community. And it's going to be more and more common with announcements we saw this week from Walmart that's going to pay for every one of their employees to upskill, right? So if we're going to move to this hybrid future of it, learning is going to happen in different places. It seems to me that this portfolio approach of, you know, I've got lifetime CBE standards that I can demonstrate and show you is a real opportunity for us to rethink education. And if I were a superintendent for 3 to 4 years and I was messaging or managing that politics, the first thing I would do is say, look, we're always going to have about 20% of our resource budget, about 20% of our time, our talent, and also our you know, technology going to what's next. So I can show you 80% of what we've been required to do. I can show you, you know, how we're making transitions, but I've got this school leader over here. I've got this grade level over here that is designing for the future. And the reason we're doing that, look at what students are saying about it. Look at what parents are saying about it. Look at their data. You care about cognitive outcomes, we're getting them, and we're getting these essential skills at the same time. And I would go before that board every year and say, you know, here's where we are and the practices that we're changing around the 80%. And here's the 20% of what's next. Because I think parents have gotten a taste of this future in COVID. They are sitting there going, I can travel, I can rearrange my schedule, my job place is changing. How do I make a life around that for how my kids learn? And we've got the equity problem of all families can't do that. So what are our challenges as leaders? Well, we saw some great soups who were like, look, I'll put Wi-Fi on school buses and come out to your community. I'll let you drive up to my school and access Wi-Fi. We'll figure out ways to feed you, give you device access. We can't waste that learning because it's applicable to the kinds of schools we design next, where it's a community-based, it's an ecosystem-based adventure, right? And
Yeah.
CBE can happen throughout it all. So I don't see that as
Holding kids to very rigorous learning.
Yeah,
That's
right.
That's the piece that we can't lose. And the standards-based world held them to content, but I'm not sure that whole drive towards standards-based really engaged kids in rigorous learning, what we call the deep learning. One of the real game changers, I think, especially when you talk to high school folks about the grading system. Oh, don't change the grading system. Is my kid going to get into college? We'll talk about college in a minute, but one of the essential pieces of the work that has really emerged in the last 5 years in the world of CBE is for communities to really define who they want as their graduate. Mm-hmm. Okay, so developing the profile of the graduate, and I've done a lot of parent groups and doing community-based vision of the graduate, profile of the graduate. And not on one group that I ever met with, be it the highway department folks or the business leaders or the school boards, no one has ever said that they want as their goal for the outcome for their graduate is to have a B in English.
Yep.
They've never defined success of their graduate in terms of grades.
Right.
What they do is they say, we want our kids to be, effective communicators. We want them to be critical thinkers. We need them to be collaborators. And as soon as you get that community agreement, this is who our graduate needs to be, then this is where the superintendent or the group doing this work steps forward and has to say, are we telling you now how your child is effective in communicating, or that they're even critically thinking? What do you see that on a report card? Do we communicate to you that this is in fact what they're learning when they're in school? The dirty secret is parents think it is. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, looking at our curriculum, it isn't. Right. So this becomes that real cornerstone, if you will, of opening up. Mm-hmm. Okay. A lot of, well, if you really do believe that, effective communication is important, then what would be the products that you would look for? Right. It's not just going to happen in an English class. Oh, so you're going to look for argumentation writing, okay, as part of effective communication. And that can sit in a social studies class or a science class. But as soon as the student demonstrates that, that's an evidence point, a proof point that you now include into that portfolio that you just talked about, Brian. Because it doesn't have to be siloed. No. All right. And that's the power of CBE. That's right. Is that you don't have to silo it into a particular content area, because you're saying, what are you learning? How are you learning it? To what are the higher ideals of the learning? Okay. Right. And the Wiggins and McTighe's enduring understanding, the why of it. That's really what you're aiming for in terms of that evidence, the proof that the student is ready for the workforce or ready for higher ed.
I want to go back to your rigor comment and also how I would see that showing up in this ecosystem idea and also in higher ed. You take a model like SAMR, where you are asking kids to create something on a Google Doc around communications. Mm-hmm. Okay. And one level of cognitive demand or rigor is that the student create an original thought or essay or paragraph or response to a prompt that, a local political challenge around water or health needs to be addressed. A next level up on that cognitive demand is who is vetting their remarks and who are they collaborating with? Who are they activating as resources for one another? Not just as student editors, but what are those people bringing in terms of research or thoughts? And so we teach them that they should depend on others and sources of information and valid research to make further arguments. And then before that argument is presented to the local town board or written into a chamber member. They must work on some presentation rigor, some data visualization to augment, right, what they've written, how that moves. And so if the community played a role in offering them authentic experiences that were going to create academic rigor to hear from students or young people in the community, you start to get at how could that portfolio then influence community college experiences, workforce experiences, higher ed. And one of the things we've been working on of late is working with universities around, for you to come back at a time of high trauma, high mental health issues, Delta variants, and to teach the same way you've always taught is now even more criminal and more malpractice than it was before. And I mean that, right? Like
I know.
If we're sending
people don't like to hear that term, Brian.
If we're sending people to college and expecting them to thrive, but college has a 40% dropout rate after the first year,
I know.
That is a waste of resources, a waste of duty of care, a waste of do no harm. And so we're at this moment, right, where, hey, let's come together around a better design and let's do things differently. So I think you can have, and I'm not saying your suggestion you can't, I'm saying you can have high cognitive demand and rigor across all of that, but the practices, the human-centered practices of support, interventions also have to be there, and leaders have to not be so hung up on arbitrary horizons of performance or outcomes. They have to look at what the adult's role was in that success or lack thereof.
Exactly. We learned a lot in developing the extended learning opportunity model. That really is, it's competency-based learning experiences in the community. In New Hampshire, in fact, we have a professional organization of coordinators in schools, and they work together to build these pieces. But it's really based on a student's interest or passion, and finding a place in the community where, under the guidance of a highly qualified teacher, will match competencies, transdisciplinary competencies, right? Because you very rarely in any experience that you ever have a pure one. You're going to be in several disciplines, all right? And use that to be the learning that they do. Again, meeting the requirements and providing kids with, time in school to learn, to do the background learning that's necessary to be successful, and where they're doing their work in the community. Doing the personal success skills, address those, because oftentimes those are the failure points for kids, and working with those. And one of the things we found out, and this is a true story, we had a conference one summer, and we pulled in all the schools that were working on developing their extended learning opportunity models, and we brought panels of kids in. First off, for people new to it, to see what their exhibition of learning looks like. They had to come in after their community-based experience and defend their learning, and be open to hearing questions from an assessment panel as well as an audience. Okay, now this is high-end performance. You can't do this the first time you do this, but these are kids that were seniors, and had done several different ELOs, were involved in some capstone work. And after a few demonstrations of that, we just had an open conversation with kids.
Right.
And said to teachers, there were 300 teachers in the room, Brian. And we said, ask these kids questions, just ask them. And the honesty that those kids use, and I really give them credit because they were not intimidated by a room full of adults. And they said, you know what? We like doing our ELOs better than we like going to school.
Yep.
And what we found, because this was a grant-funded research project, we had to do a formal evaluation. UMass came in to do the evaluative studies. We actually found that when kids were involved in community-based education, their traditional courses and their attendance, they actually demonstrated a higher level of performance. Their grades were higher, so to speak, in
Right.
the traditional courses because they were engaged in
Mhm.
something that had such meaning for them. And they saw a pathway for their future in that community-based learning, so that they saw the whole picture of it, and they wanted to succeed. And in some schools, if you can do it, it allows them to graduate early because they can get more credits, transdisciplinary. They can do a 3 or a 4 credit, uh, experience outside the school instead of doing a time-based 1 credit, and a course at a time kind of thing. So, so we know it works, right?
Right.
And we know colleges are changing. That's the other piece is they, frankly, and you're into the stuff that's going on in higher ed, they don't know how they're going to admit kids in the next admissions class
Yep.
because schools, I mean, I saw things like, we're not grading during the
Right.
pandemic. You're
Right.
what?
Right.
Not that I want the traditional grading, but you've got to communicate what the student has learned,
That's right. That's
right?
right.
So find a different way to do it, but you just can't say, oh, our grading system doesn't work in this, so we're just not grading. We're going to pass everybody. And
Mhm.
if they don't log in, then they'll
Right.
fail.
Right. Right.
Seriously?
Yeah. Yeah.
High schools need to challenge their colleges to say, how are you scoring kids in their admissions
Right.
packages?
Right. Right.
What do you want now? What do you expect now?
That's right.
You
And
know?
it's such a, you know, I'm intrigued, and I'm also advising people to have an A team and a B team. Yes, there is an A team that needs to deal with the in and out nature of operations on a
Right.
higher ed campus or a K-12 environment. But there's also a B team that needs to be working on all of the things that are contingencies that, you know, speak to how we're going to assess, how we're going to support. And
Right.
those 2 teams need to be in sync. And it reminds me of our principal days when, I appreciated your comment earlier about managers, because I would also say that when you talk to these managers, safety and discipline was like their first 2 concerns. And then if you ask them about instruction, they're like, well, yeah, I'd love to get around, but I'm just covered
I just don't
up.
have the time. Yeah.
Don't have the time.
Yeah.
And then when I
There's
was
never
writing,
enough time.
that's right. And when I was writing my dissertation, one of the things I found about high performing principals is they actually did spend time in classrooms. So that sounds oxymoronic, but it's like, the data at that time was something like 6% of their time as a principal was spent in classrooms. And if that's all you spend, you're never going to be able to have the conversations in PLCs. Right. You're never going to be able to be a contributor to the discourse, somebody who uplifts where it's happening in a great way. This goes back to your points earlier about let's find the DNA of those 5 teachers who really can demonstrate that. Let's pair them with other emerging first-year teachers. Let's get a first-year teacher who came out and really understands something about technology and assessment, and pair them with somebody else that's not as equipped. That orchestrator role of a leader, that curator role of a leader, that's something that we're not doing enough training on. We're not equipping leaders with the ability to play those multiple roles. We're training them for an environment of compliance. We're training them for an environment of outcomes based on what the feds or the state may say. And I think it's harder for people like us, and maybe this leads to a last word. It's like, once you see people doing great work in this arena, and once you know it's possible, then your job is to evangelize and educate and lead others to those understandings. And I will have fulfilled a wonderful life if people look back and say, he led understanding into these new areas, and it later translated with these people, or it went and broadened the understanding of what's possible for kids and adults. But it's a hard slog. I mean, it's not something that the majority sees or embraces. So my last point and question, I know that's a lot of context and a little bit on the couch, but I would say there's leaders out here who are going to listen to this, and they do care about leading people and teams into these next places. What's a final thought, something to give them to take heart and say, it's worth it. I've been at it for, 40 plus years and it matters.
Right. Oh, now that's a good question. I think I oftentimes, and I, oftentimes am speaking at kind of that high level, the possibilities of making systems work for kids, right? As well as getting down to the practices. Our last book on Deeper CBE really gets into how teachers do this work, right?
Yep.
But so often when I come on board with a district, and I only now work with districts that I have long-term relationships with, okay? And so I'm able to follow it, right, as we go through, and it's like a curve, right? So when you first come in, it's a little bit like the change curve, but people are really excited about, wow, we could really be doing this,
right.
And then you start getting into it, and then you get the yeah buts. Yeah, but yeah, but, and I back up and I'll say, it isn't yeah, but, it's why not?
Right.
Why not? The only thing that's constraining you is your belief that you can't do something because something has always been done a certain way.
Right.
Oftentimes they'll say, well, we can't do that. And I'll say, show me the law.
Right.
Show me the RSA or your state rule that says this is a practice that you can't have in your school.
Right.
So why not?
Yeah.
So that kind of lightens the load to say some of the mental barriers that are there. And maybe it's just a sensitivity that change is hard.
Yep.
And or someone will say, how am I going to sell this to my teachers? And I'm saying, you can't sell this. You can't sell this. You ask them to do good work. It sells it. That's what sells.
That's right.
Take the things that are burdensome to them. Okay. Give them the resources, the time, the talent, the governance of their teaching. Empower them, and you'll find that you'll move forward. So it's why not? It's not yeah, but it's yes and why not?
Love that.
Go with it.
Love that, and so consistent with the type of courage that is really a courage that's meant for the next generation and what they can do and achieve. And if you model it, they also see it and they begin to look at problems to be solved, not jobs to be had, that this is the type of thing I want to do. So Rose, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian. I always love talking with you.
Same here. Pleasure. And we'll see each other soon.
Okay. Thank you, Brian.
Take care. Bye.